I have broken down 18-year-old recruits without raising my voice above a murmur. I have stood 2 inches from a man's face and dismantled every excuse he ever gave himself for quitting, using nothing but words and silence, and the particular weight of knowing exactly when to let a pause do the work a shout never could. People assume that kind of control comes from anger held tightly in check. It doesn't. It comes from understanding, better than almost anyone, exactly what anger costs when it gets loose in a room that isn't built to hold it. That is the thing nobody at Lindbergh Elementary understood about me. The whole miserable month they watched me stand in hallways and parking lots with my jaw tight and my hands still, waiting for the version of me they'd already decided lived somewhere underneath the drill sergeant, the man who was surely, any day now, going to lose it entirely on a 9-year-old boy who had made my daughter's life a misery for 6 straight weeks. They kept waiting for the explosion. What they got instead in the end was something they never expected at all, and it took a lot longer to get there than I would have liked, and it cost my daughter more than I will ever fully forgive myself for. My name is Nathaniel Ford. Everyone who serves under me calls me Gunnery Sergeant Ford, or just Gunny, and I have spent 14 years training Marine Corps recruits at a depot most civilians couldn't find on a map, turning 18-year-old kids from 36 different hometowns into something steadier than any of them believed they had in themselves when they arrived. I am, by the account of every officer who has ever reviewed my file, one of the most controlled instructors on that depot, not the loudest, not the most theatrically intimidating, but the one recruits talk about years later as the man whose quiet somehow did more damage to their excuses than anyone else's shouting ever managed. I remember a recruit a few years back, a kid from rural Georgia who'd washed out of his first attempt at basic training and come back a year later determined not to fail twice, who once asked me, near the end of his training cycle, why I never once yelled at him the way half the other instructors yelled at half the other recruits. I told him what I've come to believe is the truest thing I know about real authority, that yelling is usually a substitute for control, not an expression of it, and that a man who has to raise his voice to be taken seriously hasn't yet learned the thing I spent my own younger years learning the hard way. Real control looks like stillness. It looks like knowing exactly how much pressure a given moment requires and applying no more than that, regardless of how much more you might be capable of applying. That recruit graduated near the top of his class, and he still sends me a card every Christmas, which is, I suspect, about as close to a compliment as a former drill instructor and his former recruit are ever likely to exchange. During that same difficult fall with Emma, I had a recruit going through my platoon who reminded me, in ways I didn't fully articulate to anyone at the time, of exactly the situation playing out at Lindbergh Elementary, a young man named Ramirez who'd been getting quietly targeted by 2 other recruits in his squad bay, subtle enough that it hadn't yet risen to the level of an official incident, but persistent enough that I'd noticed the same kind of withdrawal in him that I was watching unfold in my own daughter at home. I handled it the same way I was learning, in real time, to handle Emma's situation: careful documentation, direct but controlled conversations with the recruits responsible, protection for Ramirez that never once tipped into treating him like he needed rescuing rather than support. It struck me, more than once that fall, how much the 2 situations rhymed with each other, the professional and the personal running on oddly parallel tracks, each one teaching me something I could carry directly into the other. I have a daughter named Emma. She is 10 years old, sharp and funny and stubborn in exactly the ways her mother was stubborn, and she has been raising herself alongside me, more or less, since her mother died in a car accident 4 years ago on a wet highway on a Tuesday morning that started like every other Tuesday morning, until it didn't. I have built a life around that girl with the same discipline I bring to everything else, a schedule that runs like a formation, A house that stays orderly not out of vanity, but because order is one of the few things I know how to reliably offer a child who lost the other parent, who used to offer her softness I've never quite managed to match. I am not a soft man. I have never pretended to be one. But I love my daughter, with an intensity that would surprise most of the recruits who think they know exactly what kind of man stands in front of them at 5 a.m, barking commands. Our mornings run on a schedule I built the same deliberate way I build everything else in my life. 5:15, up, coffee, a quick check of the day's training schedule before Emma's even awake. 6 o'clock, Emma up. And this is the one part of the day where I let the schedule bend a little. She gets 15 minutes of what she calls waking up time, sprawled sideways across her bed, narrating whatever dream she's just climbed out of before she'll actually commit to getting dressed. 6:30. Breakfast. The same easy back and forth we've built over 4 years. Emma running through an elaborate ranking of that week's cafeteria lunch options, while I make sure she's actually eating, instead of just talking about eating. 7:10. Out the door. And I walk her all the way to the classroom door most mornings, even though the depot doesn't officially need me until 8, because some mornings, I've decided, that extra 10 minutes with my daughter matters more than being early to a job I could do in my sleep at this point. Weekends belong to a slower rhythm entirely. Saturday mornings mean those pancakes from Laura's recipe card, always a little lopsided, no matter how many years I've been making them, and Emma has taken, over the past year, to keeping a running, entirely unscientific scorecard of my flipping success rate that she updates with theatrical seriousness each week. Sunday afternoons, weather permitting, mean a walk through the small park 2 streets over, the same loop we've walked together since she was small enough to ride on my shoulders for half of it, talking about nothing in particular. The specific unhurried quality of time that I've come to value more with every year that passes since Laura died. Understanding, in a way I didn't fully understand before I lost her. Exactly how much ordinary, unremarkable time together is actually worth. Laura used to be the soft parts of our house, the parts that came easily to her and never quite came as naturally to me, the elaborate bedtime stories, the spontaneous trips for ice cream on ordinary Tuesdays, the particular gift she had for making Emma feel like the most fascinating person in any room she walked into. I have spent 4 years trying to learn some version of that softness without ever fully replacing it. Understanding, the hard way, that a father can't simply become a mother by trying hard enough, and that the better path is usually building your own version of care rather than a poor imitation of someone else's. Emma has never once complained about the difference. She has simply, over 4 years, taught me the parts of softness I was slowest to learn. Patient with me in ways a 10-year-old shouldn't have to be patient with her own father. I got the call about the accident during a training cycle, standing on a rifle range with 60 recruits waiting on my next command, and I remember handing off the platoon to my junior instructor with a level of calm that surprised even me at the time, some deep, buried discipline taking over before the actual grief had even fully arrived. It arrived later, that night, in a hospital hallway, and it arrived again the next morning, and it has arrived, in smaller and smaller waves, every year since on the anniversary of a Tuesday I will never be able to think of as just another Tuesday again. Emma was 6. She understood, in the limited way a 6-year-old understands anything that large, that her mother was gone and wasn't coming back. And she has grown, in the 4 years since, into an understanding considerably more complete and considerably more painful, the kind of understanding that arrives in stages as a child gets old enough to grasp new pieces of a loss they were too young to fully process the first time around. I made a decision, in the raw weeks after the funeral, that I would not let my daughter grow up in a house defined by what was missing from it. I built routines instead, the Saturday pancakes Laura used to make, which I learned to make myself, Badly at first and then well enough, from a recipe card in her handwriting I keep in a kitchen drawer and have never once needed to look at, because I've long since memorized every measurement on it. I kept her room exactly as she'd decorated it before the accident. The same soft yellow walls she'd chosen when Emma was a baby, because some continuity felt more important than any fresh start I might have offered instead. I have tried, in every way I know how, to build a life sturdy enough that my daughter would never once doubt she was loved completely, even by a father who couldn't always find the exact words her mother would have found. This is the story of the 6 weeks a boy named Brody Kessler made my daughter's life miserable, and the 6 weeks after that, when half our town quietly waited for me to do something I never once did. It started small, the way these things almost always start. Emma came home from school in September with a scraped knee she said came from just falling, and I believed her. The way you believe your kid the first dozen times they tell you something is nothing. It kept happening. A missing lunchbox. A ruined art project she wouldn't explain. A sudden, uncharacteristic reluctance to go to school in the mornings from a girl who had always genuinely liked school, who used to talk my ear off at breakfast about whatever project her class was working on, and had gone, over the course of about 3 weeks, almost entirely quiet at that same table. I noticed other things too. Small changes I filed away without immediately connecting them into a full picture. She stopped asking to have friends over on weekends, something she'd done regularly all summer. She started taking longer showers, and I found out much later that this was because she'd sometimes been crying in there where I couldn't see her face when she came out. She began sitting closer to the wall on car rides instead of leaning against the window the way she always used to. A small physical retreat that I registered without fully understanding at the time. I didn't push right away. That's not how I operate. Not with Emma, not with anyone. Pushing too hard too fast tends to make a person dig in rather than open up, whether they're a 19-year-old recruit terrified of failing basic training or a 10-year-old girl terrified of admitting something's wrong. I waited, watched, asked small, low-pressure questions at the right moments, and eventually, on a Sunday evening in early October, sitting together on the back steps after dinner, Emma told me the whole thing in a rush. Like she'd been holding it in so long the words had built up too much pressure to keep containing. Brody Kessler had decided, sometime in late September, that Emma was his target. Not for any reason she could identify. She hadn't crossed him, hadn't said anything unkind, had barely spoken to him at all before that month. Just the arbitrary, cruel logic that sometimes drives a certain kind of child to pick a target and commit to it with a persistence that would be almost impressive if it weren't so genuinely damaging. He'd started with names, working his way through an escalating rotation of insults about her clothes, her hair, the fact that she didn't have a mother anymore. A particular cruelty that had clearly landed harder than anything else he'd tried. He'd moved on to isolating her, working his considerable social influence among the 4th grade to make sure other kids steered clear of her at recess, sat elsewhere at lunch, treated her, within a matter of weeks, like someone slightly contagious. And more recently, in the last 2 weeks before that Sunday conversation, it had turned physical. A shove in the hallway that had produced the scraped knee, a accidental trip during gym class, a shoulder check hard enough to knock her lunch tray out of her hands in front of half the cafeteria. There was one friend, a quiet girl named Priyanka, who sat near Emma in class, who never fully joined the isolation campaign the way most of the other kids eventually did, though she wasn't brave enough, at 10 years old, to openly defy Brody's considerable social pull either. She found small, careful ways to stay close to Emma anyway, walking a slightly longer route to the bus so she could fall in step beside her, sharing half her snack at recess without ever making a production of it, sitting near enough at lunch to offer company without directly challenging whatever unspoken rule kept the rest of the table clear. Emma told me about Priyanka before she told me about Brody, actually, mentioning her almost in passing one evening, and it wasn't until much later that I understood the full weight of what that small, steady loyalty had meant to my daughter during the worst of those 6 weeks. One person who never once made her feel invisible, even when an entire 4th grade class seemed to have collectively decided she was. Emma didn't tell Priyanka everything either. In those early weeks, the same careful instinct toward silence that kept her from telling me the full picture right away. Kids, I've come to understand, often carry shame about being bullied that has nothing to do with anything they actually did wrong. A confused, misplaced sense that being targeted somehow reflects a flaw in themselves rather than a flaw in the person doing the targeting. Emma carried that shame quietly for weeks, telling herself, the way she later admitted to me, that if she just didn't react, didn't give Brody the satisfaction of a response, it would eventually stop on its own. It didn't. It rarely does, not without an adult stepping in properly, a lesson I wish more of the adults around that situation had understood as clearly and as quickly as I eventually came to. I sat very still on those back steps, listening to my daughter describe 6 weeks of accumulating cruelty in a voice that kept threatening to break, and I felt something in my chest go cold and sharp in a way it hadn't gone in a very long time, not since a training exercise years earlier when a recruit under my direct supervision had gotten seriously injured through another recruit's carelessness. The last time I could remember genuinely struggling to keep my own reaction contained to something professional and useful rather than something that would only make the situation worse. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked once she'd finished, keeping my voice as even as I could manage. Emma picked at a loose thread on her sleeve, not meeting my eyes. I thought if I just ignored it, it would stop. "And I didn't want you to be upset. You already have so much to deal with, and I didn't want to be one more hard thing." Something in that answer landed harder than almost anything Brody Kessler had done to her. The specific, devastating realization that my 10-year-old daughter had been quietly protecting me from her own pain, absorbing 6 weeks of cruelty largely alone, because she'd decided, somewhere along the way, that my burdens mattered more than her own. I took her hand, the small, familiar shape of it, that still, some days, catches me off guard with how much it has grown since she was small enough to fit her whole hand around just my thumb. "You are never one more hard thing," I told her, holding her eyes now, making sure she understood this completely. "You are the reason I get up every single morning. Nothing that happens to you is ever too much for me to hear about. Do you understand? I would rather carry the hardest version of your day every single day than have you carry it alone because you were trying to protect me. That's my job. Let me do my job." She nodded, tears finally spilling over now that the whole story was out, and I pulled her into a hug that lasted considerably longer than either of us probably needed, though neither of us minded at all. I did not raise my voice that evening. I have never once raised my voice at my daughter, not in 10 years, and I wasn't going to start over something that had already hurt her enough without her father adding fear of his own anger on top of it. I asked careful questions, gathered the timeline, the specifics, the names of any teachers who might have witnessed any part of it, and then I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that this was going to stop. That it was not her fault in any measure, and that I was proud of her for finally telling me even though it had clearly cost her something significant to do it. What I did not tell her that evening, because a 10-year-old doesn't need to carry her father's internal battle on top of her own, was exactly how much effort it was taking me to keep my voice at that level. Exactly how many different versions of confronting this situation were running through my mind. Most of them requiring a level of restraint I don't often have to reach for outside of a training environment specifically designed to test it. I called the school first thing Monday morning, before I'd even finished my coffee, and asked to speak with someone about a bullying situation involving my daughter. I was transferred twice before I reached Miss Patterson directly, and I could hear, even in those first few sentences, the particular strain of a young teacher managing considerably more than any one person should reasonably be expected to manage 26 students, most of them decent kids navigating ordinary fourth-grade friendships, and apparently at least one situation that had clearly outgrown whatever informal monitoring she'd been able to offer on her own. "I've noticed Emma seeming quieter," she admitted, once I'd laid out what Emma had told me the night before. "I didn't realize it had gotten to this point. I'm so sorry, Sergeant Ford. I should have caught more of this earlier." I told her honestly that I wasn't interested in assigning blame to a teacher managing a room full of kids largely on her own, that my priority was simply making sure this stopped, properly, through whatever official channels the school had for exactly this situation. She was helpful in every way she was capable of being helpful. Requesting a formal meeting with the assistant principal for later that week, and promising, in the meantime, to keep a closer eye on Emma during the parts of the day less directly supervised. I spent the 3 days before that meeting preparing the way I prepare for anything that matters writing out. In careful, factual language, exactly what had happened, the specific dates, the specific incidents, stripped of any emotional language that might give someone an excuse to dismiss it as an overreacting parent's exaggeration. I wanted the facts to speak plainly enough that nobody in that room would have room to argue with them, understanding even before I walked in that the moment this became a battle of tone rather than a battle of facts, I would lose whatever ground I'd built simply by being the parent everyone already expected to be intense about it. That meeting happened 3 days later, and it was there that I first encountered Craig Kessler, Brody's father. A man whose confidence filled a room the way certain men's confidence always seems to, built less on actual substance than on the simple, practiced assumption that other people would generally defer to him. Craig ran a successful contracting business in town, sat on the school's booster club board, and had clearly never once, in 10 years of parenting Brody, been asked to seriously consider that his son might be the problem in any given situation. He sat across that small conference table from me with his arms crossed, listening to the assistant principal lay out the specifics of what Emma had reported, and responded with the particular, practiced dismissiveness of a man who has never had to genuinely examine his own child's behavior. "Kids are kids," he said more than once. "This sounds like normal fourth-grade stuff to me. Kids fight. Kids say mean things. And then next week, they're best friends again. I don't think we need to make some huge production out of it." I would learn much later, from a conversation with Miss Patterson that neither excused nor fully explained what Brody had done, but at least offered some shape to it. That Craig ran his own household with a version of the same dismissive bluntness he'd brought to that conference room, quick with criticism, sparing with warmth. The kind of father who measured his son's worth mostly through athletic performance, and rarely asked, in any real way, how Brody was actually doing underneath the performance. Brody's mother had left 2 years earlier, in a divorce considerably more bitter than the one that ended my own marriage would have been had Laura lived long enough for us to fail each other that way. And Brody split his weeks awkwardly between 2 households that seemed to agree on very little except a shared unwillingness to look closely at how the split was actually affecting him. None of that made what he did to Emma acceptable. But it explained, the way cruelty usually does when you finally get close enough to see its roots, exactly where a 9-year-old learns that picking a target smaller than himself might be the only kind of control he has access to in a life where very little else feels controllable. I sat across that table, hands folded, voice level, and explained, point by careful point, exactly why 6 weeks of escalating, targeted harassment culminating in physical assault did not qualify as normal 4th grade stuff. Citing the specific incidents, the pattern, the deliberate isolation tactics that go well beyond an ordinary schoolyard disagreement, Craig Kessler listened to all of it with the particular unmoved patience of a man simply waiting for his turn to speak again, rather than genuinely absorbing anything being said to him, and at the end, he looked directly at me, and said the thing that very nearly, for one genuinely dangerous half-second, tested every ounce of the control I have spent 14 years building. "Look, I get it, you're a Marine. You probably want to handle this the tough guy way," he said, with something that might have been meant as a knowing smile. "But maybe ease up a little. Kids need to learn to work things out themselves. That's how they build character." I did not respond to that immediately. I have trained myself, across 14 years of standing inches from furious, frightened, defiant young recruits, to let a full 3 or 4 seconds of silence do more work than almost anything I could say in the heat of the moment, and I used every one of those seconds that afternoon. Looking at Craig Kessler across that conference table, feeling the specific focused anger I rarely let myself feel move through my chest, and choosing, deliberately, not to give it anywhere to land. "My daughter has a bruise on her hip from where your son's shoulder checked her hard enough to knock a lunch tray out of her hands in front of 30 other kids," I said, finally, my voice carrying none of the heat I actually felt, level and controlled in the same register I use to deliver the worst news a recruit is ever going to hear from me. That's not character building. That's an assault that happened to a 4th grader who has already lost her mother and does not need to also lose her sense of safety at school because the adults in the room decided this was something kids should just work out themselves. Craig's easy confidence flickered, just slightly, at the specific mention of the bruise, though he recovered quickly. Muttering something about getting both sides of the story before the assistant principal, a tired, well-intentioned man named Mr. Abernathy, who had clearly navigated more than a few of these meetings, without ever quite finding a way to make them fully satisfying to either party, visibly uncomfortable, redirected the conversation toward next steps, a formal warning in Brody's file. Closer monitoring during recess and lunch, a promise, thin and unconvincing even as it was being made, that the situation would be handled. I pressed him, before the meeting ended, on what closer monitoring actually meant in practical terms, and Mr. Abernathy, to his credit, admitted honestly that the school's resources for this kind of ongoing supervision were limited, that a single aide covering recess for 3 grade levels couldn't realistically catch every incident, and that meaningful, lasting change would ultimately depend more on Brody's own behavior shifting than on the school's ability to police every interaction. It was an honest answer, and I respected the honesty even as it left me with the clear understanding that nothing was going to change quickly through official channels alone. It was not handled, not in any real sense, over the 2 weeks that followed. Brody's harassment shifted, becoming more careful, harder to catch in the act, but no less persistent, a whispered comment in a hallway with no teacher nearby, a deliberately excluded invitation, a small, targeted cruelty here and there, designed specifically to stay just below whatever threshold might trigger another meeting. Emma, increasingly, stopped telling me the small details. Not because she'd stopped trusting me, but because she'd started, I think. Absorbing some version of the same message the adults around her seemed determined to send, that this was simply something she needed to learn to handle on her own. Word moved through the parent network at Lindbergh Elementary the way it always does, and within that same stretch of weeks, a particular narrative had taken hold that I only became fully aware of secondhand, through a conversation Miss Patterson had, awkwardly, felt obligated to warn me about. Several parents, watching the situation unfold from the sidelines, had started quietly speculating about when, not if, the drill sergeant was going to finally snap and do something about Brody Kessler, personally confront him directly, intimidate him, handle it the way they imagined a man with my job title must surely handle everything, given half a reason. It was, in its own way, its own kind of cruelty, an entire community more interested in watching for an explosion than in actually protecting a 10-year-old girl, treating my restraint not as evidence of character, but as a fuse slowly burning down toward an inevitable, entertaining conclusion. I overheard a piece of that particular conversation myself. Standing in line at the grocery store 2 weeks before the fall festival, two mothers I recognized vaguely from school pickup discussing the situation in the kind of voice people use when they think a topic is interesting enough to be worth the small risk of being overheard. I heard he trains recruits, like actually breaks them down. One of them was saying, not unkindly exactly, more with the breathless fascination of someone describing a minor local celebrity. I keep waiting for him to just show up and scare the daylights out of that Kessler kid. Honestly, at this point, somebody probably should. I didn't say anything. I paid for my groceries, nodded politely when one of them recognized me, and went slightly pink with embarrassment, and drove home, turning the exchange over in my mind the whole way, understanding, with a clarity that didn't make it any less frustrating, that half the adults in that town had already written the ending to this story in their heads, and that ending didn't actually involve anyone protecting my daughter. It just involved watching me perform a kind of anger they found entertaining to imagine. I heard about that particular rumor mill on a Thursday afternoon, standing in the school pickup line, and felt something in me harden slightly against an entire community that had apparently decided watching for my breaking point was more interesting than actually addressing the problem in front of them. But I did not break. I have never broken. Not under circumstances considerably more provoking than a smug contractor and a rumor mill of bored suburban parents. And I was not about to start now. Over a situation where any loss of control on my part would do nothing but hand Craig Kessler exactly the narrative he'd want the aggressive military father, overreacting, making a scene, deflecting attention away from his own son's behavior entirely. I talked about the situation, during that stretch, with the one person at the depot I trust enough to bring my personal life to First Sergeant Diane Okonkwo, a woman who had been training recruits nearly as long as I had, and who had a teenage son of her own, navigating his own version of adolescent cruelty a few years back. She listened to the whole thing one evening after training had wrapped, the two of us leaning against a fence rail watching the last recruits of the day file back toward the barracks, and offered me the kind of blunt, useful perspective only somebody who has actually walked a similar road can offer. You know, the hardest part of this job isn't teaching these kids to be tough, she said. It's teaching them when toughness is actually the wrong tool for the situation in front of them. You're about to learn that lesson all over again, except this time it's your own daughter on the other side of it, and every instinct you've spent 14 years building is going to be screaming at you to handle it the way you'd handle a threat on this depot. Don't. That's not what she needs from you. She needs you steady, not fierce. There's a difference, and you already know it better than almost anyone I've ever worked with. I have thought about that conversation more than once since, understanding, more fully each time I revisit it, exactly how much wisdom Diane packed into those few sentences leaning against that fence rail. Steadiness and fierceness aren't opposites, not exactly, but they serve different purposes, and knowing which one a given moment actually calls for is, I've come to believe, one of the harder skills any parent or any instructor ever has to learn. So I kept doing what actually works, the slow, unglamorous, unsatisfying work of proper channels, documenting every incident in writing, requesting follow-up meetings, involving the school district's official bullying policy rather than my own considerable capacity for intimidation. Coaching Emma at home on concrete strategies for staying near teachers during vulnerable periods of the day. Rebuilding. Piece by careful piece, some of the confident 6 weeks of cruelty had worn away from a girl who used to walk into that school, building like she owned the place. The coaching itself took the shape of small, practical exercises rather than any grand pep talks, the same way I've always believed real skill gets built through repetition, through small, manageable steps rather than one overwhelming lesson. We practiced, at the kitchen table some evenings, exactly what to say if Brody approached her again. Short, calm, unbothered phrases that gave him nothing to feed on, delivered in a flat, steady tone we rehearsed together until it came naturally rather than sounding rehearsed. We talked through which adults on the playground she trusted most and how to position herself near them during the parts of recess, when supervision tended to thin out. We worked, too, on something less tactical and more foundational, helping her understand, in terms a 10-year-old could genuinely internalize, that none of what was happening to her reflected anything true about her own worth. That cruelty says everything about the person delivering it and nothing at all about the person receiving it. She resisted some of this at first, the particular resistance of a child who has already decided, privately, that the problem is somehow her own fault. That if she were different, somehow quieter, louder, more like the other kids, less obviously grieving a mother the rest of her class had mostly forgotten she'd lost, none of this would be happening to her. It took weeks of patient, repeated reassurance before that particular belief finally started to loosen its grip, and I understood, watching it loosen, exactly why the slow work mattered more than any single dramatic gesture ever could have. The situation finally reached its breaking point, not through any explosion on my part, but through an incident at the school's fall festival in late October. A Friday evening event with games and a bake sale that half the town turns out for every year. Emma had been excited about it for weeks, one of the first things she'd shown genuine enthusiasm for since September, and I had taken the evening off specifically to be there for it. Standing near the ring toss booth, watching my daughter laugh with a couple of the friends who had, gradually, started drifting back toward her once the worst of the isolation campaign had lost some of its momentum. The schoolyard had been strung with string lights for the occasion, hay bales arranged around a small pumpkin patch the Ta had trucked in specially. The smell of kettle corn and someone's grill drifting across the whole scene, and for the first time in weeks, I'd watched my daughter move through a crowd of her classmates without the particular, careful wariness that had settled into her shoulders since September. She'd won a small stuffed frog at the ring toss booth and immediately named it Gerald, for reasons she refused to explain, and I remember thinking, standing there in the cooling evening air, that this might be the turning point. The evening things finally started feeling normal again. Brody found her near the edge of the schoolyard, away from the main cluster of booths and adult supervision, and whatever restraint the increased monitoring had forced on him during school hours apparently didn't extend to a Friday evening event where the usual staff presence was thinner and more distracted. I didn't see the initial confrontation. I was 3 booths away, momentarily distracted by a conversation with another parent, but I heard it, a sharp cry followed by a sudden, ugly commotion, and by the time I'd crossed the distance between us, moving fast in a way that had every nearby adult's head turning, I found Emma on the ground, having been shoved hard enough to fall, scraping both palms on the gravel path, with Brody standing over her, red-faced and furious about something, and a small, horrified cluster of other kids and a couple of parents already gathering. I remember, with total clarity, the specific half-second when I reached that scene and every single person nearby the gathering parents. The teachers hurrying over, even, I think. Brody himself visibly braced for exactly the explosion the whole town had apparently been waiting 6 weeks to witness. I remember feeling the full weight of that expectation land on me all at once. The particular pressure of an entire crowd, assuming they already knew what kind of man I was about to become in front of them. There was a recruit, my second year as an instructor, who once dropped a live round during a range exercise through sheer carelessness, an error that could have gotten somebody genuinely hurt if the safety protocols hadn't caught it in time. I remember the whole platoon bracing for what they assumed would be a legendary explosion. The kind of story that gets told and retold for years afterward. Instead, I walked the recruit through, in a flat, quiet voice, exactly what could have happened, exactly what discipline was actually for, and made him personally responsible for retraining the entire platoon on that specific safety protocol the following week. It did more to change his behavior and the platoon's understanding of what real accountability looks like than any amount of shouting ever could have. That recruit is a staff sergeant himself now, training his own platoon somewhere on this same depot, and he still tells that story, I'm told, as the moment he actually understood what discipline meant. I have felt something like that pressure before, standing over a recruit who has just done something genuinely dangerous through carelessness or arrogance. The entire platoon watching to see whether I'll finally lose the legendary control they've all heard rumors about, and I have learned, across 14 years of exactly those moments, that the pressure to perform anger is its own kind of trap, one that costs you something real every single time you give in to it. I thought, in that half-second, about Laura, about the particular gentleness she brought to every hard moment in Emma's life before the accident took her, and about the promise I'd made myself, somewhere in the raw first months of grief, that I would try to carry some of that gentleness forward on her behalf, especially in the moments it would be easiest to abandon it entirely. I knelt down beside my daughter instead. I checked her hands, her knees, asked her, quietly, whether anything was broken or whether it was mostly just the fall itself that hurt, and helped her to her feet with the same careful, unhurried attention I would have given any injured person regardless of circumstance. Only once I was certain she was all right did I turn my attention to Brody Kessler, who stood there, still red-faced, now visibly uncertain in the face of a reaction that clearly wasn't unfolding the way he or anyone else present had expected. The crowd that had gathered a dozen parents, a handful of teachers, a cluster of wide-eyed kids, had gone almost entirely silent, watching with the particular, deflated confusion of people who had shown up expecting one kind of story and were now watching a completely different one unfold in front of them. I could feel Miss Patterson, who had arrived moments after I had, watching with something that looked, in the corner of my vision, almost like relief. Emma, standing beside me with her scraped palms held slightly away from her sides, watched the whole exchange with an expression I would spend a long time afterward trying to name something between surprise and a kind of quiet, dawning pride, as though she were watching her father become, in real time, exactly the man she'd always believed he was underneath the discipline and the quiet. I did not raise my voice. I crouched down instead to something closer to his own height, the same technique I sometimes use with the youngest, most frightened recruits on their very first day. The specific power of making yourself smaller rather than larger in a moment that calls for real attention rather than intimidation. And I asked him, plainly, what had happened. Brody, startled by the absence of the fury he'd clearly braced for, stammered through an explanation that amounted, essentially, to Emma having looked at him the wrong way, an excuse so thin even he seemed to recognize its weakness as he was giving it. I listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when he finished, I asked him one more question, quiet and direct. Do you know why grown-ups who really understand strength never use it against people smaller than them? Brody, clearly expecting almost anything except a question, shook his head slowly. Because real strength isn't about what you can make somebody else afraid of. I told him. It's about what you're willing to hold back, even when you have every advantage in the room. I train young men every single day who think strength means being the loudest, the scariest, the first one to throw a punch. Every single one of them learns, eventually, that the strongest people they'll ever meet are usually the quietest ones, the ones who could do real damage and choose, every single time, not to. You knocked down a girl half your size because she looked at you wrong. That's not strength, son. That's the opposite of it. That's somebody who doesn't understand strength at all yet, and I think, somewhere in there, you probably already know that. By then, Craig Kessler had arrived, pushing through the small gathered crowd with the particular urgency of a father who has just realized his son is at the center of a scene. And he opened his mouth, clearly prepared to launch into some version of the same dismissive defense he'd offered weeks earlier in that conference room, and then stopped himself, taking in the scene properly for the first time, his son uncharacteristically quiet, listening intently to something I was saying rather than performing outrage, and Emma, standing beside me with scraped palms but otherwise steady, watching the whole exchange with wide, careful eyes. "What happened?" Craig said, quieter than I'd ever heard him, directing the question at his own son rather than at me. Brody, to his credit, didn't lie. He told his father, haltingly, exactly what he'd done, the shove, the reason behind it that even he seemed to recognize now as inadequate, and something in Craig Kessler's face shifted as he listened. The easy, dismissive confidence I'd encountered in that conference room finally cracking under the weight of hearing his own son describe, in his own words, exactly the kind of behavior Craig had spent weeks insisting was simply normal kid stuff. Craig didn't say much to me directly that evening, beyond a stiff, uncomfortable apology that clearly cost him something to offer in front of a gathered crowd. "I owe you a real apology," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it. "Not just for tonight. For that meeting a few weeks back, too. I told you your daughter's problem was normal kid stuff, and I said it because it was easier than admitting my own kid might actually be the problem. That's on me, not on you, and I'm sorry it took this long to see it." I told him I appreciated him saying so, and that what mattered most now wasn't the apology itself, but what he did with it going forward. He nodded, something visibly settling in him. A man recalibrating an entire understanding of his own son in the space of a few uncomfortable minutes. But the following Monday, he requested a meeting of his own with the assistant principal, this time without any defensiveness at all, and asked, plainly, what kind of consequence and what kind of intervention might actually help his son understand what he apparently hadn't understood on his own. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, not overnight. But it was real, and it mattered considerably more than the apology itself. Brody's behavior toward Emma stopped entirely after that Friday evening, not through any lecture I delivered or any punishment the school handed down, though both certainly played their part, but through something closer to genuine recognition, a boy who had spent 6 weeks testing exactly how much cruelty he could get away with, finally confronted, plainly and without theatrics, by a man who had every reason and every capability to make him afraid, and who chose instead to make him understand. The counseling program Craig eventually enrolled him in met twice a week for the rest of that school year, and though I never learned the specifics of what happened in those sessions, I saw the results secondhand, through small, accumulating changes. Miss Patterson mentioned to me over the following months Brody raising his hand more often to help rather than to draw attention, Brody apparently intervening, once when a younger student was being teased by somebody else entirely, a small but genuine sign that whatever he was learning in those sessions was starting to reshape something more fundamental than just his behavior toward Emma specifically. I don't know exactly what turned that particular corner for him, whether it was the counseling, or his father's newfound attention, or the memory of a Friday evening when a man he'd expected to terrify him chose instead to simply talk to him like he mattered. Probably some combination of all three. Change like that rarely comes from just one source. Emma, in the weeks that followed, slowly rebuilt the confidence 6 weeks of cruelty had worn away from her. Helped along by the particular, hard-won knowledge that her father had shown up exactly the way she needed him to, not as a weapon, but as a steady, controlled presence who had handled the worst 6 weeks of her young life without ever once losing himself to the anger he was clearly entitled to feel. She started talking at breakfast again, first in small pieces and then, gradually, in the full, unfiltered chatter that used to be her default setting before September ever happened. Priyanka's quiet loyalty finally got the recognition it deserved that November, when Emma, unprompted, asked whether her friend could come over for a proper sleepover, the first she'd hosted since the whole ordeal began. I remember standing in the kitchen making them popcorn that evening, listening to the two of them laughing about something on the other side of the wall, and feeling a specific, quiet gratitude toward a 10-year-old girl who had never once abandoned my daughter even when abandoning her would have been the easier, more socially convenient choice. I made a point of thanking Priyanka's mother properly at pickup the following morning, understanding that her daughter's steady kindness had mattered more to Emma's recovery than almost anything the adults around the situation had managed to offer. Emma also started, that winter, keeping a small notebook she called her brave list, nothing formal. Just a running record of moments during the day when she'd chosen to speak up, to sit somewhere new, to try something that had felt frightening after the isolation of the fall. She showed it to me only once, shy about it in a way that told me it mattered to her more than she wanted to admit, and I told her, honestly, that I thought it was one of the smartest things I'd ever seen anyone do to rebuild something that had been taken from them. She still keeps some version of that notebook going, even now, months later. A small, private testament to exactly how much resilience a 10-year-old can build when she's given the room and the support to build it properly. Craig Kessler, to his considerable credit, followed through on the changes he'd committed to after that Monday meeting. He enrolled Brody in a counseling program the school district offered for exactly this kind of situation, and he started. By several accounts I heard secondhand over the following months, showing up more consistently to Brody's own activities, asking more real questions, offering the kind of attention his son had apparently been missing badly enough to go looking for it in the worst possible way. I ran into him at the grocery store myself, sometime in December, and he stopped me, awkward but sincere, to tell me that Brody had asked, unprompted, whether it would be all right to apologize to Emma properly rather than just through the school's mandated process. I told him that was up to Emma, and when I asked her that evening, she thought about it seriously for a while before deciding she'd like to hear it. Craig and I ran into each other several more times over that winter, at school pickup, at a community fundraiser, at the same grocery store more than once, and each encounter carried a little less of the old tension and a little more of something that eventually, somewhat to my own surprise, settled into a kind of cautious mutual respect. He asked me once, standing in a parking lot in February, with sleet coming down around us, how I'd managed to stay so controlled that Friday evening, when he himself, watching his own son crumble under questioning, had felt something close to panic rise up in his own chest. 14 years of practice, I told him, and a promise I made myself a long time ago that I'd never let anger make a decision my calm mind would regret later. Doesn't mean I don't feel it, just means I've learned not to let it drive. Craig considered that for a long moment, sleet gathering on his shoulders, and told me, quieter than I'd ever heard him speak, that he wished somebody had taught him that lesson 30 years earlier, before he'd spent most of his own adult life reacting first and thinking second. It was, I understood even as he said it, about as close to genuine vulnerability as a man like Craig Kessler was likely to offer a near stranger in a grocery store parking lot, and I respected him for it more than I let on in the moment. The apology, when it came, happened in the assistant principal's office on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Brody sitting across from Emma, with his father present, working through an apology that was clearly rehearsed but no less genuine for the rehearsal specific about what he'd done. Honest about not having a good reason for any of it. Careful in a way that suggested somebody had actually helped him understand what a real apology required, rather than a token one. "I'm sorry I called you names," he said, looking mostly at his own hands rather than at Emma. Though he made himself glance up periodically the way, I suspected, his counselor had coached him to do. "I'm sorry I told the other kids not to sit with you. I'm sorry I pushed you at the festival. There wasn't a real reason for any of it. I think I was just having a hard year, and I took it out on you because you were quiet, and I figured you wouldn't fight back. That wasn't fair, and I'm really sorry." Emma listened to all of it with the same steady composure she'd been building back up all fall, and when he finished, she told him, simply, that she accepted it, and that she hoped things got easier for him, too. A generosity that struck me, watching from the side of that small office, as considerably more mature than most adults manage to offer people who have wronged them. "You don't have to be my friend or anything," Brody added, awkwardly, as though this needed clarifying. "I just wanted you to know I actually mean it." "I know you do," Emma said. "Thank you for saying it right." The two of them never became close. Not in any real sense. Some wounds don't fully heal into friendship, and I never once expected them to, but the harassment stopped entirely. Replaced by something closer to careful, distant civility that held steady for the rest of the school year and, as far as I know, has held steady since. I have thought more than once since that fall about how differently this whole story might have gone if I had let the anger win, even once, even for a single unguarded moment. It would have been easy, in a certain sense easier, even, than the sustained discipline it actually took to hold my temper through weeks of dismissiveness from a man who should have taken my daughter's pain more seriously from the very first conversation. Anger is simple. It doesn't require patience, or documentation, or the slow, unglamorous work of proper channels. It just requires letting go. But letting go, I have learned across 14 years of training young men and, eventually, of raising a daughter alone, is very rarely the same thing as actually solving anything. It usually just relocates the problem, handing it a new, uglier shape to wear. The rumor mill, I should say, mostly went quiet after that October evening, though not in the way the town's more theatrical imagination had probably hoped for. There was no dramatic confrontation to gossip about, no scene involving raised voices, or a furious father finally living up to his reputation. What there was, instead, was something quieter and, I've come to believe, considerably more interesting. If anyone had actually been paying close enough attention, a man who had every reason and every capability to frighten a 9-year-old boy, choosing instead to teach him something, and a town slowly, grudgingly, coming to understand that the story it had been telling itself for 6 weeks had been the wrong story entirely. Miss Patterson told me once, near the end of that school year, that she'd started using the fall festival incident, in a careful, anonymized way, as an example in the classroom's ongoing conversations about conflict and character, without ever naming names. Simply describing a moment where the adult everyone expected to lose control chose something harder instead. I don't know how much any of that landed with a room full of 10-year-olds, But I like to think some small piece of it did. The same way I like to think some small piece of what I try to teach my recruits eventually lands somewhere useful, even on the ones who seem, in the moment, entirely unreachable. She told me too that several kids in the class had started, unprompted, being more thoughtful about excluding classmates after that lesson, small shifts she noticed in the lunchroom and at recess that she couldn't attribute entirely to any one intervention, but that felt, to her, connected to the broader conversation the whole grade had been having that fall. I found myself thinking, more than once, about the strange symmetry of it, that the same restraint I'd built for the purpose of shaping young Marines into steadier versions of themselves had ended up, almost by accident, shaping a room full of fourth graders toward something better too. I have never once thought of parenting and instructing as the same job, not exactly, but I have come to believe they draw from some of the same well. The same understanding that real influence rarely comes from the loudest voice in the room. I think about that fall festival often, the specific weight of an entire crowd's expectation pressing down on me in the half-second before I chose, deliberately, not to give them what they wanted. I have spent 14 years training young Marines that the loudest man in the room is very rarely the most dangerous one. That real control is measured not by what you're capable of, but by what you're willing to hold back even when everyone around you assumes you won't. I got the chance that October evening to prove it to my own daughter, in the one arena that has always mattered to me more than any training depot ever could. Word of what happened at the fall festival eventually made its way back to the depot, the way stories about the instructors always seem to find their way around eventually, filtered through whatever channels connect a small town to the people who work at the base nearby. Diane brought it up one morning a few weeks later, catching me before the day's first formation, a knowing look on her face that told me she'd already heard some version of the story from somebody's spouse or somebody's neighbor. "Heard you had yourself a moment out there," she said. "Whole town waiting for Gunny Ford to finally lose it. And instead you go and teach the kid a lesson without raising your voice once. That sound about right?" "About right," I admitted. She nodded, satisfied, the particular satisfaction of someone watching a lesson she'd offered actually take root. "Good," she said. "That's the job, Nate, on this depot and off it. Anybody can be scary. Takes a real man to be steady when scary would have been so much easier." She clapped me once on the shoulder, the closest thing to open sentiment either of us usually allowed ourselves during a workday, and moved on toward her own formation, leaving me standing there for a moment longer than I strictly needed to, turning her words over the way I turn over most things worth keeping. Emma asked me once, months later, sitting together on those same back steps, why I never once yelled at Brody, why I never even really got angry in any way she could see, given everything he'd put her through. "I was angry," I told her. "Angrier than I've been in a long time." But anger's not information, Emma. It doesn't tell you anything useful about what to actually do next. The men I respect most in this world are the ones who feel the anger fully and then set it down anyway, deliberately. Because they understand that what you do next matters more than what you feel in the moment. I wanted you to see that. I wanted you to know that your father can hold enormous strength and choose, every single time, to use it carefully. That's the only kind of strength worth having, and it's the only kind I ever want you to respect in anybody, including me. She was quiet for a while, turning that over the way she turns over most of the ideas I hand her that feel bigger than 10 years old usually has to manage. "Do you think Mom would have handled it the same way?" she finally asked. I thought about that question longer than most of the questions Emma asks me, because it deserved real honesty rather than a quick answer. "Your mom would have handled it her own way," I said. "Probably with more warmth than I managed. Honestly, She had a gift for making even hard conversations feel gentle. But I think the core of it would have been the same. She never once believed that love meant protecting you from every hard thing. She believed it meant standing next to you while you went through the hard things, steady. So you never had to face them completely alone. I've spent 4 years trying to give you both halves of that, hers and mine, even though I only ever really had my own half to work with. I think you did both halves pretty good, Emma said, with the particular uncomplicated certainty of a child delivering the highest compliment she knows how to give. A full year after that fall festival, on the 1-year anniversary of the incident itself, though neither of us marked the date deliberately, Emma came home from school and told me, almost as an afterthought while she was unpacking her backpack, that Brody had been chosen by his class to give a short presentation about kindness for an anti-bullying assembly the school held every October. She told me about it the same easy, unguarded way she told me about most ordinary school news now, no weight in her voice at all, and I understood, hearing the casualness of it, exactly how far both kids had traveled in the year since that Friday evening, one from perpetrator to a boy trusted with teaching his classmates something better. The other from a girl frightened to walk through her own school's front doors to a girl who could mention her former tormentor's name without a flicker of the old fear crossing her face. I didn't have much of an answer for that, beyond pulling her a little closer, the two of us sitting together on those back steps in the fading evening light, the particular quiet that has become one of the steadiest, most trusted parts of both our lives. She leaned against my shoulder, quiet and steady, the way she always does when the day's ordinary news settles into something that feels, underneath it, like real peace. I believed, sitting there with her in the fading light, that we had both finally, fully arrived on the other side of it. I still do.